Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Edwards. I'm the Executive Director of Conservation Strategy Fund. Welcome today. Thank you for joining our webinar entitled Leveraging Economics and Finance for Nature. During the webinar, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. You can do that throughout the webinar, and then our panelists can answer in real time or at the end of the presentations. We're here today to talk about a very important topic. I'm sure you've all heard that the biodiversity finance gap is upwards of $700 billion per year. How do we bridge this gap in time by 2030, let's say, particularly when countries that should be contributing to this effort or leading this effort, like the United States, are setting a horrible example right now and going backwards, not forwards. Unfortunately, in the next hour, we're not going to necessarily have a silver bullet for you, for all of us, but we are going to suggest an approach and some strategies we think will significantly contribute to filling that gap. But we can't do this alone. So if you are interested in hearing more about our work, what we do, what Conservation Finance Alliance does, and possibly partnering with us after, please get in touch with me or David after the webinar, and we'd love to discuss more with you. So if you know anything about Conservation Strategy Fund, you know that we specialize in economics, specifically what we call conservation economics. We have experts that work locally around the world and partner with different institutions, trying to educate decision makers, whether they be in the government or in companies or civil society, about the value of the value of protecting and restoring nature. But we go further than that. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about this exciting partnership we've forged with Conservation Finance Alliance and using economics to inform, develop, and strengthen innovative financial solutions for nature. So during the webinar, you're going to hear CSF staff. We've invited some staff today to talk about some real world solutions that we're implementing, building in the Amazon on biodiversity loss and how to address biodiversity loss, and on funding protected areas in Bolivia. But first, to start off, I'd like to introduce David Myers, the Executive Director of Conservation Finance Alliance, who's going to tell you more about CFA, Conservation Finance Alliance. So David, please.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be partnered with the Conservation Strategy Fund. And
I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Actually, you were first, so
I think yeah, I think I'm good. Okay. Yeah, we're just I'm going to just give a little overview of how we interpret conservation finance, and then I'm going to give you some background on the Conservation Finance Alliance and additional resources that you can find to learn more. So generally, we look at conservation finance in a holistic point of view and define it as mechanisms and strategies that generate, manage, and deploy financial resources and align incentives to achieve nature conservation outcomes. So it's really a package. It's not just about raising money, but really it's about how effectively and impactfully we manage that money and how we deploy it to achieve the results, and then about aligning incentives, which really is a long-term way to make sure conservation is achieved. And we've been supporting the concept of these 4 practice standards, and they're going to sort of come out as part of a new guidance for protected area finance. But just real quickly, we encourage practitioners to think about optimizing resource efficiencies to start with. Are there cost savings we can find? Are there partnerships that are more effective to achieve our outcomes? Discouraging harmful actions. How can we use finance mechanisms to discourage harm to nature, which is really one of the main drivers of cost? Incentivizing positive actions, identifying opportunities for creating the right incentive structure for business, government, and civil society and individuals. And then finally, increasing that financial capital for conservation. Let's not start there, but let's end there if that's what we need. little background on the Conservation Finance Alliance. We are a global professional alliance of conservation finance experts, practitioners, and organizations with around 2,800 individual members plus and 40 or so institutions. Our mission is to promote awareness and expertise, and as well as innovation and conservation finance globally. And we do that through different working groups, task forces. We have a working group on innovation, and I'll tell you a little bit about our incubator shortly. We have, we're also doing work on nature credits, and we have a protected area working group, which is now the WCPA Sustainable Finance Specialist Group of the IUCN Commission. We have a Marine and Coastal Finance Working Group, which has developed a really interesting tool. And we have an Environmental Funds Working Group, which has been really the longest running working group in the CFA. And we produce a range of guidance materials for conservation trust funds. We also do research, advisory, produce reports, and capacity building, which I'll tell you a little bit about. First off, the incubator, we're in round 3 right now, and someone's going to put a link to the incubator website here. The call for proposals is open. We've got multiple partners, and please consider submitting your innovative conservation finance idea to the incubator. We are about to release this new practice guidance for protected and conserved area finance with the IUCN WCPA. This is the first time people are seeing the cover, so very exciting. Long time coming. We've been supporting the Coral Triangle Conservation Fund in collaboration with a range of partners. Coral Triangle is one of the most important areas for coral conservation. We're right now raising money for a nature finance accelerator. This is focused on biodiversity credits. And as part of this, we have been developing with a task force a concept called nature stewardship certificates, which is a way to help bring finance to areas that are high ecological integrity and really important for conservation that don't necessarily have the obvious quantifiable destruction that's required for a lot of nature or carbon units. So that's watch this space. We've done a lot of work with the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, investment plan, strategic plan, investment principles, and are currently working on a coral reef finance paper in collaboration with Conservation Strategy Fund. We have a podcast, which you should definitely check out. It's called 4Nature Podcast. And this is an example of who we interviewed, Superorganism, Tom and Kevin. Really fantastic interview. And then we produce reports. So this is a 2020 framework or white paper report that's widely cited that provides a taxonomy of conservation finance. We produce the practice standards for conservation trust funds. This is the 2020 update, a 10-year review of conservation trust funds, and most recently, a tool that helps identify and prioritize portfolio of finance solutions for the marine and coastal space. We collaborate extensively with the CSF on the Numbers for Nature Training Institute. We support the seminal annual training program and are developing online and additional courses on conservation finance. So watch that space. And if you want to hear more and find out more, visit us at conservationfinancealliance.org or cfalliance.org. The website has a lot more information, and thank you very much. Scott, over to you. Oops, you're still muted, Scott. So
Unmute. Okay. Thank you, David. So I'm going to talk briefly about Conservation Strategy Fund. Then we're going to give the floor to Stephanie and to Pedro to talk about some work that we're doing, exciting work that we're doing. So Conservation Strategy Fund, we are a global conservation organization. We have about 40 staff spread across 7 countries in the Amazon, South Africa, Indonesia, headquartered in the US. We have a budget of about, annual budget of about $3 million. We run 40 to 50 projects per year through analysis and training. The numbers for Nature Institute David mentioned. We currently have a training going on right now in Latin America with more than 30 participants. And we get funding from a mix of grants from foundations and contracts with institutions like the World Bank, IDB, GIZ, et cetera. So CSF was founded essentially to address the problem that was identified long ago, that the values of nature were not being integrated largely into policy decisions at that time. And while this problem has, let's say, it's been addressed somewhat, it's improving. I think companies, governments are starting to understand more the contribution that nature makes to economies, to global GDP. That's been widely publicized, that information, but it's still not addressed completely. And that's because one problem is the short-term thinking by decision makers, the political cycle within companies. It's the quarterly reports that need drive short-term thinking. But also the economics is not being fully utilized and by decision makers. So what we see as a solution is to get out there and share this economic information in the public and private sector and with civil society, with organizations that you might be working for, to share this information with shareholders and stakeholders so that they can integrate these values of nature into their decision making that benefits nature and people. So our theory of change is that we work very closely because we're a fairly small institution, with 40 or so staff. We rely on partnerships. We partner very closely with the bingos like TNC, WWF, CI around the world. We work also very closely with governments, and we essentially bring the economics to them through our analysis, through our training, so they have a greater understanding again of the full suite of values, whether they're negative or positive, with respect to protecting and restoring nature, protecting or restoring nature, or destroying nature. And so essentially that information gets used to make better decisions. We have 4 strategic priorities. The first is to estimate the benefits of protecting nature and restoration. And we do that largely through our ecosystem services valuation. And we look at both those ecosystem services that have market values, like carbon credits, for example. Carbon credits can be bought and sold on the market. And those things that do not have market values, like, for example, a polar bear. But we can quantify those values, again, to lead to better decisions so that can understand what values or benefits are nature providing. And then we also look at the cost of destroying nature. And we started doing that 25 years ago, looking at infrastructure projects throughout the Amazon, primarily focusing on roads and dams. While there were financial analysis often done on these types of infrastructure projects, we didn't have a full suite of information on how are these projects impacting nature, how are they impacting people and other ecosystem services. And now that kind of information leads to better decisions. We're not against development of infrastructure projects. We know they're important, but understanding what are those externalities with these types of projects. Thirdly, and I'm going to give some examples in a minute, but we work and we have been working in conservation finance for quite some time. And I'm going to give some examples in the next slide. Fourth, our capacity building, and David mentioned again, the Numbers for Nature Training Institute. We combine, what sets us apart, I think, from a lot of different groups that do a lot of analysis, that we combine this with a lot of capacity building. More than 5,000 people have been through our courses over the last 25 years. And it's really important to understand not only like the information and that we bring in with our economic analysis, but how to use that information in a way that, again, brings about better decisions and understanding the trade-offs. With respect to conservation finance, we believe that economics really form the foundation of conservation finance, and that we essentially make the business case for nature and try to have a better understanding, like why is it important to invest in nature, and why does that make good dollars and cents? And we do that in several different ways. One way is through payment for ecosystem services schemes that we've developed. We did a project several years ago in Mexico with a water utility. We have worked on value chain analysis and working with cacao farmers and fishermen in the Amazon to bring about greater sustainability and profitability to their company. We recently started working on carbon credit projects, working with ranchers and farmers, looking at what's going to incentivize farmers and ranchers to participate in a carbon credit project, and how do we ensure that we have equitable distribution of benefits to the various stakeholders participating in this program. And lastly, and I've already mentioned this, we quantify the in economic terms, the benefits of nature through ecosystem services valuations and economic impact analysis. And I'm going to mention a project on the next slide. So a couple of examples of some work we've done in conservation finance, and Stephanie's going to talk about what we call the Passport for Conservation, a project we recently completed well, it's still ongoing with the Bolivian Park Service, financial mechanisms that we think will bring in more than $2 million per year to a grossly underfunded park system. And then secondly, in Peru, we recently conducted an analysis looking at the economic impact of their protected area network. And through the analysis, we identified that for every dollar invested in the protected area system, there is a return to the economy of $9. So it's a 900% ROI. So investing in nature, investing in conservation makes good business sense, makes good sense for the economy. Pedro is going to talk about some of our environmental valuation tools that we've developed. I like to call them decision maker support tools. These are available on our website. I think we'll have a link in the chat. They are free and they are amazing. We have two that look at the impacts of certain activities. One is mining, illegal gold mining using mercury, artisanal gold mining in the Amazon. And the second is deforestation and what those impacts are, and calculates those. And then third, an indigenous lands management calculator, which calculates the cost of properly managing and stewarding indigenous lands, so that indigenous peoples can use that information to ideally bring about greater funding, public or private, into indigenous territories. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie, who's going to talk about the Passport for Conservation that she worked on in Bolivia. So Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. How are you? It's a pleasure for me to be here with you all. My name is Stephanie. I'm an economist based in La Paz, Bolivia, and I've been working for the last 2 years with the team to design this financial mechanism. So this mechanism was developed in collaboration with the National Service of Protected Areas, CERNAP. This is the public institution that is in charge of managing national protected areas that has and presents a lot of challenges to effectively protecting these natural spaces, mainly because of financial gap that reaches over $7 million to cover the basic needs for a year of operations. As part of this, sorry, give me a second, please. So as in many other countries and aligned with the Project Finance for Permanence initiative that Bolivia recently joined, integrating multiple financing strategies and engaging different stakeholders can improve CERNAP's capacity to effectively protect these natural spaces while covering the basic needs and reach financial sustainability. CSF, along with other partners such as WWF, has been working in identifying new potential mechanisms that will help CERNAP to face many challenges they are constantly facing. With the support of the Swedish Cooperation Agency, CSF made a review of different experiences around the region that include countries like Peru, Chile, Mexico, and Colombia. This review led to the identification of an innovative mechanism. This mechanism will not only allow to to generate income for CERNAP, but will also promote national tourism in protected areas. The design of this mechanism was carried out through a technical study that will be sharing the link in the chat. The link will be shared in the chat. And this study allows us to optimize the mechanism to the design of different components. These components go from the strategic allocation of resources to the communication strategy. An analysis of Bolivians' willingness to pay established an optimal fee of 200 Bolivianos, $29. This fee will allow to maximize the income while expanding the reach of the passport. Here in the slide, you can see the income projection that was established through the analysis. For a yearly income projection, it was established that the passport could contribute to reduce the financial gap with over $2 million of income generated each year. One of the most important things that was established through the study is the concern about the public resource management. Here in Bolivia, the public resource management hasn't shown to be optimal, and there's a lot of distrust from the general public, which the passport is, which is the objective public for the passport. This is why also through the analysis, we made a proposal for the strategic allocation of the generated income. The main objective is that at least 90 to 95% of the total funds will be assigned to protecting and monitoring activities, especially to park rangers activities. Another component that is important, as we mentioned, since we want to promote national tourism in protected areas, is improving the quality of the services and especially promoting sustainable tourism, so the protected areas will not be affected negatively by the new visitors. And one last thing that I think is one of the most innovative part of this mechanism is that we're planning to introduce the environmental education through sharing information about the importance of these areas through different platforms and social media that was created specifically for the passport for conservation. This innovative mechanism has been part of a wider approach, as you can see with all the elements that have been developed, and it's been in its initial phase of implementation. This started with a launch event that was conducted in December. Here you can see some of the pictures of the event, and it was supported by public sector, private sector, and international cooperation. This initiative aims to create a stronger bond between the civil society and the protection and conservation of protected areas. Actually, well, right now we are in the phase of evaluation. It's like the first year of evaluation, which CSF keeps supporting CERNAP to help them to improve the reach of this passport. This is why we are collaborating with them to establish a strategic partnership that will allow to expand the reach of the passport while creating a sense of shared responsibility for the conservation of protected areas. This has been a really exciting project that we've been working, and we were making partnership with photographers, with different local businesses, and also with the communities around the protected areas that will help us promote the passport and help us create the awareness of the protected areas that will help preserve the natural resources and biodiversity in Bolivia. This is the final presentation. I hope you enjoy it, and I hand it over to Pedro.
Thank you, Stephanie. Well, hello, everybody. I'm going to provide a quick overview about our online valuation tools and decision support tools that we have been developing in CSF in the past years, and some ideas and concepts for new tools also that we are planning to develop. So first, our tools are user-friendly tools and free of charge. So the idea is that any non-economist could use these tools, could access our website and do some valuation exercises with it. We provide an economic model that links the context input variables to monetary outputs. I'm going to provide some examples to you on how this works for a couple of calculators of ours. And we have two types or two groups of tools. The first one supports investment decisions. So it will support planning, fundraising, budgeting of activities. And the other groups is more focused on supporting the definition of fines and sanctions. So starting with some examples here, imagine a protected area that needs resources to be managed. What are the current costs of protecting nature and culture? How much should be invested for different levels of protection, right? So that these are questions that every manager, and not only protected area managers, but also indigenous associations and other types of NGOs have, also donors providing resources to support management of these protected areas. But these questions are always hard to answer. It's time consuming to budget some activities depending on the level of implementation. And so we designed these tool to answer these questions. Our tool is the Indigenous Land Management Cost Calculator. It was designed initially in the Xingu River Basin in the Brazilian Amazon. And as many of you know, indigenous lands are the most effective type of protected area in terms of forest conservation in Brazil. They suffer a lot of threats from external invasions, from illegal logging, illegal gold mining. And then these communities in these protected areas need to deal with that, with those threats. They have territorial management plans, but they have a series of technical and operational challenges. And designing these plans and budgeting it is a real challenge. So associations and donors need to better understand these financial needs and gaps. And for that, we created this decision support tool. The idea is that there are several management activities separated into some groups like governance, monitoring and protection, cultural strengthening, income generation, etc. And so we modeled the costs for 29 activities. So we've done a lot of econometric assessments to understand how these costs vary depending on the land characteristics. So this is part of our dashboard. So the user will have to enter some inputs here, such as the population size, the total area of this indigenous land, the level of threats that the lands are suffering, among other variables, but which are simple to get, all these variables, if the land is contained in this river basin. They are all automatically downloaded, let's say. If they are not, we can extrapolate these informations and input one by one. And the idea is that based on these input characteristics, the model will predict the cost, the annual cost for each of these 29 management activities. So I'm not going through all these definitions and management activities, but the idea is that we will have as a result a more transparent and efficient management and less time spent designing these activities and budgets. So after we know how much it would cost, we could have another types of questions. So for example, imagine that one of these protected areas is illegally invaded and degraded. So what are the costs of nature destruction? How much should be invested to restore the area and to compensate well-being losses? So we have, for this example, another calculator, the Mining Impacts Calculator, that we launched in Brazil in 2021 in partnership with the Public Prosecutor's Office. It supports the government to calculate environmental fines and also the benefits of improved protection for these areas. These was the first tool to value mercury impacts. So it's an innovation in the literature. and we published all these methodology innovations in 3 academic papers. So these tools have a lot of economic background and reviewed by our peers. So the dashboard, the user needs to also include some input variables. It varies from 8 to 10 variables, such as the type of gold extraction, pitch depth, the area, etc., the location, that will define a lot of other variables, such as population density, species richness, etc. And this dashboard will provide as a result a series of valuations for each subcomponent, being deforestation, erosion, and mercury contamination. Each of these impacts or big groups of impacts will have sub-impacts, and there's a lot of graphic information that we provide so non-economists can also understand how these values were calculated. And as a result, we see that on average, the social cost from illegal gold mining is 2 to 3 times higher than the private benefits from the sale of the gold. The policy implications that we have so far with that, the public prosecutor's office are using to calculate fines that sum up to more than $9 billion so far. We have a case in the Brazilian Supreme Court, which also used the calculator to provide these values for the judges. And we are now expanding the calculator to other countries also. So those 2 examples provide some narrative to understand how we can use these tools to provide more resources for managing, for compensations, and we have more ideas to develop new tools such as marine area management cost tool, a climate adaptation strategy tool, conservation finance tools, restoration calculator, which we are already developing in 2025. And on the side of the impacts calculator, we have new concepts to be developed such as the fire impact calculator, infrastructure impact assessment tools, oil spill calculator, wildlife trafficking calculators. So there's a lot of potential. And the idea is that these tools, they are not only about valuation, but they are about action. We want to use these tools, right? So let's make a better decisions and policies based on this information. Thank you so much. And I pass to Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Pedro, and Stephanie, very much for those interesting presentations. I think David, you're going to follow up and moderate any Q&A that we have that is not. I've seen and answered a couple of the Q&A on the webinar, and there might be a few that people want to share verbally with you. So I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Scott, and thank you, Stephanie and Pedro. Really great presentations. And so, yeah, as Scott is saying, please do put your questions into the Q&A. That's where I'll be getting some inspiration from to ask some additional questions of everyone here. I'd like to sort of start with the overall theme of the use of economics for informing finance. So maybe Stephanie, to you first. You mentioned that you did this analysis to figure out what the right price. Can you tell us a bit more, like, how you use probably willingness to pay study and just the general the relationship between economics and this specific finance solution for entrance fees?
Thank you, David. Yes. Well, we conducted a contingent valuation methodology that is currently used to evaluate environmental services that are not part of the market and cannot have a price established by demand or offer, right? So we conducted a survey. It was conducted for the 15 main urban cities in Bolivia. We reached over 1,100 respondents, and implementing a methodology that is, well, if you need more specific details of the methodology, you can find it in the article that's been published in Land Magazine that I think Sam or Annie shared it in the chat, but if not, maybe they will now. But It was the characteristic of this methodology is to present this environmental product. So we created a scenario where we presented the basic characteristics that was designed while the review of the literature and other experiences. So basically, this is a passport. It's more conceived as a donation that has an additional benefit, and that is how it was presented. The benefit is that you are able to visit the protected areas without paying the entrance fee. We have 24 protected areas, and right now our 15 are ready for tourism, and there are 4 more that are just about to be ready. But the idea is that citizens in Bolivia, that is how it was presented, can contribute to conservation through a donation for the activities established in the strategic allocation. This is very important because when we presented the scenario, all the characteristics were included in the final design. And especially, we discovered that the knowledge about protected areas in Bolivia is really, really low. People aren't aware which are protected areas. So this was one of the main results, I think, that I like to make a little bit of emphasis in it, is the awareness of protected areas. So yes, and it's basically the inputs come from the Bolivian citizens, 18 and over, and that's why we have the design made specifically with the characteristics that we identify. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting that because one of the benefits of tourism is increasing awareness, right? So you're trying to achieve both those outcomes of raising money, but also increasing awareness, which also helps convince the government to increase their budgeting for protected areas. So we like to look at protected area finance as a portfolio of solutions. And so that's a great example. So wishing you all the best of luck with that new program. And Pedro, I wanted to ask you a bit about the cost calculator and you know you had mentioned that it's to try to streamline project development and design. Have you seen has it been implemented yet? Have you seen opportunities? You know, have you seen the use of it for helping fundraise or helping to planning? What do you think is what I like to say the killer app, the best use of that calculator going forward?
Yeah, so we launched the calculator. It's been perhaps 6 months, a little bit less than that, and we had a capacity building series to build awareness and for the users and these indigenous associations. So we invited 8 indigenous associations in the Xingu River Basin to be trained. We had a series of sessions to do that, and they provided us the raw cost data that we used to model. So they were the users, basically our target audience, and we had all the time to train them on how to use the calculator. And we had a great feedback from them, you know, so we see the smiles in their face. Okay, how easy now is to budget some of these activities, right? Something that took before months to do, and they see a lot of sense in the numbers that were produced by the calculator. So we are still kind of close from the launch date, right? So they're starting using the calculator right now. But the first feedback that we had was really great, and I'm sure that will help them a lot.
Excellent. And very impressive too, the result of the mining calculator and how it's being used to establish fines. And I know you're expanding to other countries, and I think it's a really great tool. So I'm looking forward to seeing that being implemented. And Scott, a question for you. So we had some questions coming in the Q&A about
Yeah.
you know how different valuation methods are used, and how it's hard to capture sort of the especially the value of nature to indigenous people. Of course, it's hard to capture the value of nature to nature because it's not necessarily the huge. So, but can you just give us your take on what we can and can't kind of say and how to build the business case for nature using these valuation methods, and if it's just sort of, if it's hard to estimate, you know, what can we say about it, and how does it help us make the case? Tough
Yeah,
question.
sure. Yeah, and if Pedro wants, who's the real economist here in the room, and Stephanie want to add to this my answer, but yeah, we have done a lot of ecosystem services evaluation studies that I've already talked about, right? But and there are dozens of ecosystem services that can be evaluated, right? And oftentimes we did a study, for example, in Alaska, in a very remote area. And while there might be 28 or more different ecosystem services that we could look at, we often try to take those ones where we think there's going to be the biggest sort of bang for your buck. Like, what are the ones that are going to be the most valuable that we can actually measure and monitor over time, because these things need to be measured and monitored over time as well. So some of those things have, again, a market value, like in this particular area. There could be a carbon credit project, so we can include that in our evaluation. But there are other things like just the existence of this huge area in a very remote part of the country where basically no one goes to visit. So, but it has a strong, it's an indigenous land. It has a very strong meaning to those who, there are only like 2,000 people that live in the area, and it's just enormous. So if you just look at what do 2,000 people value over this large area per acre, it's practically nothing, right? So you have to, what we did was we looked at and interviewed and surveyed people in the lower 48 of an area in Alaska. And yeah, those are, willingness to pay surveys is one way to do it. It's somewhat theoretical. It's, you know, you're asking people, how much would you pay to protect an area that you will probably never go to, you will never see in your life, you probably never even heard of, and that is and they're never actually going to pay. So it's a really hard number to define and and really kind of say this is the right number. It's sort of your best estimate. So it is difficult, but we try to get as close as we can to what we think these ecosystem services provide. And again, the ones that are non-market values are very difficult. But the economists in the room can tell you more about the different types of studies like contingent valuation, the willingness to pay surveys, choice experiments that Pedro is an expert in, that can help people sort of conceptualize and understand like why is it important to protect biodiversity, this particular area, and try to compare scenarios. That's choice experiments, when you compare different scenarios, and then you can identify those different variables within the scenario have a certain value once you've done those sort of surveys through choice experiments. So there are multiple ways to do it, but it is not easy. And Ranja mentioned too, that, you know, just engaging with indigenous people sometimes can be very difficult. They may not trust the interviewer, the surveyor, and Pedro has some experience working with the Munduruku in Brazil. I remember some stories he was telling me about just engaging with that community was not particularly, you know, an easy thing to do. So I don't know, Pedro or Stephanie, if you want to add anything to that.
Sure. I can add something about, I think the moment we are in the economic literature, let's say, that now we have more and more valuation studies. It allows us to use different methods, different valuation methods, such as the based on meta-analysis. So when we have a large literature body, let's say of 100 or 200 valuation studies, we can work with the average of these studies and on how these averages are conditional to some context variables. So we are using this a lot in our calculators. So we have some average values, but we know that these values can change and, let's say, increase if there's a higher population density or decrease if there's a lower population density. This method is called the benefit transfer functions, right? And this is something that makes valuation easier, because sometimes we don't have time or resources to go to the field, interview people is really challenging sometimes. And so we have this interesting moment, let's say, that we can use this meta-analysis to have something, a simplified analysis also. And it provides interesting examples on the valuation of several different ecosystem services. I think just to comment on carbon markets also, because there is carbon and there are a lot of different ecosystem services, right? That are not regulated yet, but sometimes these ecosystem services are under the carbon umbrella, let's say, and people are willing to pay price premiums for these additional biodiversity values or cultural values. And this is shown by this increased willingness to pay. And so this is still something that is dependent on our current context, that we have the carbon markets being regulated or advanced in terms of regulation and providing and producing market values. And these other ecosystem services, sometimes they come together with the carbon or under the carbon umbrella. So it's also interesting to see how things evolve and the methodologies evolve also, right? So depending on the amount of information and literature, we can work with different approaches.
Great. Yeah. So, there's sort of I find there's two values that economics provides for conservation finance specifically. One is, kind of providing some basic numbers to make this business case, and really that just gets you to the table with the decision makers. You're speaking the language of the Ministry of Finance, Ministries of Economy, and in conservation we struggle with that, getting the attention, right, of these people. But the other approach is that it actually provides us really clear insight into how to structure a finance mechanism to be effective, the greatest chance of success. So maybe back to you, Stephanie. And there was a question that someone had asked, about payment for ecosystem services, and what examples do you have? How do you, what kind of studies do you need to carry out to understand how to get a kind of a payment for ecosystem service system functioning? And I'm going to expand that to the protected area. In other words, like, were you able to use the economic analysis to convince the government that, hey, these protected areas are really worthwhile, and here's a finance mechanism that can work because people are willing to pay? I'm curious, Stephanie, your
Yes, that's exactly what happened, actually. The Passport for Conservation has a really good acceptance in all levels. We had really good acceptance by the Ministry of Environment and Water. We have international cooperation that's really excited about the mechanism, and that's why we were able to launch it on December in an event that had a lot of different actors, including local communities that live around protected areas. So I think this is a great example of how we can engage different stakeholders and social society to be part of the conservation process, especially because promoting national tourism, that is one of the other components of the project, will help with the development of the communities that provide tourism services around the protected areas, even inside the protected areas. So the idea is to promote this type of activities because we already have the support of the government. We have the tourism vice ministry as well, and a lot of support, actually. It's been really an amazing project to work with. It's been really attractive, and it's created a lot of expectation. But as it was mentioned, one of the main components is the communication strategy, because it has a lot of reach, and we are working with partnerships, like I mentioned, that will allow us to expand it and to make it more attractive, even with that even more than it already is. So yes, I think this Passport for Conservation is a good example of how a technical analysis can provide the background to implement something and have this innovative tool that be part of something that's creating a lot of not only resources, but a lot of awareness and responsibility with protected areas and conservation. It's really the communication strategy and the marketing promotion are part of that we're focusing a lot, and then we're keep supporting CERNAP with it. So we are really excited with the project, and I think it's a good example. So how we can have information directly from the Bolivians, in this case specifically from Bolivians, to make a successful mechanism that will involve all the citizens in Bolivia. But yes, I think we are really, really excited because this project is created a lot of interest for all the actors that are in Bolivia, and it even has the support of the president that has already his passport, by the way.
Right, excellent. That's reaching high levels. So there was a question that came up, sort of a couple questions that came up on subsidies and on tax policy. And, I'm going to open this to anyone here. How can we, and I think the answer is complex, but, can you give us some examples of how to use the type of economics that Conservation Strategy Fund uses to inform subsidy reform, to inform tax policy that could potentially improve the alignment of conservation objectives and nature objectives with that of the country's development plans? Simple question. Open to anyone.
Pedro, you want to address that one?
Okay, I can provide one example. It's more like an idea because it's really challenging to address, especially perverse subsidies, taxes, etc. There's a lot of politics in that. But for example, there are some countries that have some mitigation policies related to deforestation, right? So if you deforest, there's a regulation, and sometimes you need to pay something to compensate or to mitigate it, right? So, and the tax is expected to reduce a little bit the deforestation because the deforestation becomes less profitable, right? So if the governments can, or governments in general can create a kind of a virtual cycle, right, where you can get and use this money from the mitigation policies, this type of taxes, to pay for some ecosystem services or to pay for conservation or best management practices, for example, right? You can, including, keep it inside or within the agricultural sector, right? Because agriculture sometimes is the sector that will deforest, but we have like efficient agriculture and not efficient agriculture, right? So if you tax the non-efficient and you provide incentives to the efficient farmers, right? So you have a really virtuous cycle, let's say, and you don't have such a policy problem because the agricultural sector will lose and gain, right? So you're not just taking from them and giving to any other sector, but you can keep it in the agricultural sector. It's just a matter of understanding and providing the right criteria of efficiency and sustainable land use. So this is just one example, not to go much deeper in this very controversial topic.
This is an area of a lot of interest and a lot of need for additional work, and so I know that you're thinking of exploring this, and so any advances there would be greatly appreciated. Well, I want to thank all of the great questions of everyone, and thank you all for your participation.